predictions we're doing this time is going to be much more focused on the economy and how dynamics in the economy are impacting telecom, and we expect to impact telecom as this year plays out. So that's going to be the focus today. There's my email addresses there. If anybody wants to email me, feel free to do so. Just so everybody's aware, the research that we're going to be sharing today comes from the list of reports on the right-hand side here in that blue box. And then we added some on top of that. So some of the foundational stuff came from those reports. For those of you on the call that are subscribers to the research, you can go look at those reports for more information. And then the list of reports on the left-hand side, that chart, is what the Telecom group at TBR produces per year. So some of those reports are annual, semi-annual, and quarterly. And we have reports on various benchmarks and various markets within the telecom ecosystem, as well as vendor and operator-specific reports. So for today's agenda, we're going to start off by setting the stage for 2026. We're going to talk about three things. Again, these are going to be focused on the economy. We're going to talk about bad debt expense. We're going to talk about offering adjustments, and we're going to talk about a price war that is, I would argue it's already started for high-speed broadband. We're going to talk about that, kind of the hidden price war, and then how it becomes more mainstream and acknowledged. I'll talk about that when we get to that section. And then we're going to do key takeaways and then have some time for Q&A. So setting the stage for 2026, I think everybody has heard of the K-shaped economy. This is a topic that became mainstream after the COVID pandemic and the economic bifurcation we saw between the top 10 or 20% and the bottom 80 to 90%. And this is so pronounced, what we're seeing in the data and the way it's impacting different types of companies. It's become so pronounced that we had to talk about this because this is really dictating strategy for businesses. We're seeing it in financial services. We're seeing it in healthcare. We're seeing it in food. We're seeing it in like consumer packaged goods. We're seeing it in a whole host, automobiles. We see this very clearly. This dynamic in the economy also impacts telecom. And this is a topic that I have not heard other analyst firms talk about. So we really wanted to lean heavily on this instead of talking about the typical topics of AI and AI, edge computing, all the typical things. I wanted to focus on the things that are not talked about, but that are very real. And these are things that executives are dealing with. This is what lines of business are dealing with, what sales teams are dealing with, marketing departments, how they're having to adjust. So this is pan-business impact, and that is what I wanted to shine the spotlight on here. So that's what we're going to do here. So the K-shaped economy is real. It's becoming more pronounced. I mentioned this started with the COVID pandemic, but the bifurcation continues to widen. I mentioned that the top 10 to 20% of households and businesses are doing exceptionally well. So if you look at the headline economic numbers, I think GDP for the last quarter was something like 5% year-over-year growth. That is incredibly strong GDP growth for a developed nation to perform at that level is incredibly, that's an outlier. And so the headline numbers look good. Unemployment is very low. The headline numbers, it looks like, earnings are increasing. But when you peel back the layers and look at the different facets of the economy, what you realize very quickly is that there is a portion of the economy that is doing exceptionally well. And then there's everybody else that's kind of treading water or is doing worse off than they were pre-pandemic. And I'm going to show data on this from a telco perspective that shows this is happening. We'll get to that. So the bottom portion is doing progressively worse or treading water. We're talking about the mainstream here. We're talking about the vast majority of people, households, businesses is doing not so well. And the economic gains are accruing to that top echelon. And that has an impact on the customers that the telcos are selling to, what those customers are buying, what they're able to buy, how they're buying, decisions that they're making. Companies have to adapt to this. They're adjusting to this reality. And I want to stress that this is not just about the US. We see this happening in many countries. This is happening. Australia, it's happening in parts of Asia. We see it in South Korea, for example. This is very prominent economic dynamics we see there. This is happening in, to some extent, in China. This is happening. We see it in parts of Europe, prominently happening. So I want to, is this happening in Canada? So this is not just about the US. This is I would argue most of the global GDP, if you look at it from a percent of global GDP, I would argue that most of that is in this boat of this bifurcation that we're seeing. But I would say it's the most pronounced in the US. That's where we see significant divergence at every quintile of the economy. We are starting to see telcos, some telcos, aligning to this economic situation. I'm going to give tangible examples of this, of initial indicators that show that telcos are adjusting this, and cable companies. Okay, so we're going to show that through the predictions we're going to make. So we're going to make a prediction, and then we're going to show some context for why we're making that prediction. So the first prediction we have is that bad debt expenses are going to rise for CSPs. We talked about the K-shaped economy. That's the trend. The driver is the bifurcation, and the result is that bad debt expenses are going to continue to rise. We're going to see it significantly increase this year. And it is entirely possible that on the back half of this year, or even in the next year, that we could see CSP bad debt expense reach or exceed levels witnessed during the Great Recession. That's very concerning, but this is the reality of what's going on. And I'm going to give you guys very specific examples of where we're seeing this and why we're coming to that conclusion. So, headwinds. The student loans were one of the biggest things that were stopped during COVID, where there was economic relief. So basically people could extend the maturities of those loans and not have to pay them back. There was a grace period, essentially. But ultimately, those loans do need to be paid back. And I think people are hearing about that in the news now. Those things are starting to come back into effect. Those COVID protections have ended now. There are tens of millions of households in this country that have student loans, and they weren't paying those for the last 4 or 5 years. Now they have to reintroduce that into their budgets. That must be paid. That cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. So those loans have to be paid. And that pulls away from discretionary income that could be spent in on other things. We're seeing a significant increase in subprime car loan delinquencies. The pace of the increase mimics what we saw in the Great Recession for subprime specifically. I'm not talking about alt prime or prime. But that's concerning because, as we know, subprime is the first indicator for what could come on the higher levels of the prime ranking. We're seeing foreclosures spiking. We're seeing inflation has come down from where it was, but it remains relatively high over the last 15, 20 years. So the last 15, 20 years pre-COVID, inflation in the States was running at about 1.5 to 2% per year, for context. Since COVID, on average, it's been running at 3 to 4% on average. Okay, that's a significant, that's basically a doubling of the pace of price increases across a basket of items. We can argue about, how accurate is headline inflation. I think it's reasonable to assume that those numbers are undercounting what real inflation actually is, especially when we look at healthcare, insurance costs, daycare, those types of things. Those costs are going up many times higher than the official inflation rate on a per year basis. But this is where you see that bottom end of the K is really struggling from a budgetary standpoint. Those finances don't look good, but the headline numbers of the economy look really good because the top 10 to 20% are doing phenomenally well. All-time highs on balance sheet basis on average. Stocks are at all-time highs. They continue to hit records. Most of the wealthy have their money in stocks, bonds, equity, and businesses. All of that is going up. And that is part of the contributor to the bifurcation, as well as home prices continue to be at all-time highs. Tariffs haven't really had a major impact yet, but that could have an impact. That could feed inflation going forward. We saw a lot of companies pre-buy leading up to the tariffs, so they had significant inventory to sell down, which delayed the impact of tariffs. We're starting to see on the retail side tariffs starting to flow through product pricing. So we might see an uptick in that as this year plays out. That's going to be another impact on budgets. Jobs are good on a headline basis, but we see a lot of layoffs in the news. We saw Verizon recently. We've seen other companies outside of telecom have major layoffs. Those are high-paying jobs that are basically going away. You have the impact of AI, which is impacting the job market in some way. These are things that impact confidence, consumer confidence, business confidence. Immigration is something not really talked about from an economic standpoint, but if you look at household formation, and if you look at the net increase in new sub ads for telcos, those numbers are coming down. Household formation has dramatically slowed in the last 2 years, dramatically. It's a fraction of 1% per year now. That means that there is significantly smaller pool of net new broadband eligible premises to get service. So you see broadband providers fighting for share now. You see more price evolution there, solutioning to take market share and protect existing market share versus going for raw growth. That part of that reason is immigration. Immigration was probably the biggest driver of household formation over the last 10, 20 years in the US. That's just the reality. Just based on pure numbers, it doesn't matter what political affiliation someone might be. On a pure number standpoint, that is a fact. So now that that's slowing, what does that mean for telco, right? Phones. If people are emigrating or being deported, that's fewer subscribers for US service providers. In Europe, if we see immigration policy change significantly, you're going to see similar trends. We already see it in Canada, and the Canadian operators have publicly said that immigration is slowing their growth. They're on the record saying this in Canada. And their policy changes have been nowhere near as pronounced as in the US. So clearly this is something to keep in mind. Interest rates remain relatively high versus what they have been over the last 15, 20 years. That means interest rates that people are paying are higher. It means that their buying power goes down. Social safety nets are eroding. You have the Obamacare going away. You have food stamps. That is changing. The policy for that is changing. There's other programs that are being changed that are impacting people at the bottom quartile or bottom half of the economy. That's who it's mostly hitting on that side, causing adjustments. Bankruptcies are going up. And what we're seeing, if we take it all together, many consumers and businesses are struggling under this weight. Okay, so this is the reality. So you have a group that's doing incredibly well, arguably better than they've ever done. And you have a much larger group that's doing worse than they were doing. And now the question is, how does telecom adjust to this reality? So what we're showing here is data. Okay, we literally took these numbers from 10Ks and we normalized it and we put it out over multiple years to see a trend line. And we have AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile here. And what you'll notice is that two things. Number one, in 2020 and 2021, those rates dipped significantly. That's when we saw the US government pump multiple $1 trillion of stimulus into the economy. A large portion of that went into debt paydown and balance sheet repair during COVID to weather the COVID pandemic. So we saw provision for credit losses significantly declined across the board for telco. That's what we saw. This is in the numbers. The second thing we see from this chart is that since 2022, the level of provision for credit losses is higher than it was in the pre-pandemic years. That is significant. What we're seeing is on the trend line here is that we're starting to close that gap with what we saw in and around the Great Recession time period of 2007 to 2011. That time window, we're starting to see a gap closing there. And we're expecting those numbers for 4Q and for 2026 to be meaningfully higher than they were in the first 9 months of 2025. So those numbers are going up. This is money that the telcos will not collect. The other thing that is not reflected in these numbers is the impact of deportations and emigration, people leaving the country for whatever reason. In many cases, they do not pay their bill. They don't pay those phone bills. So the telcos are sitting on, I would argue, hundreds of thousands of subs that are not paying and that have no intention to pay. And the telcos have been carrying that with the expectation that those people are ultimately going to pay, even though they're probably not going to pay. So you're going to see potentially an adjustment higher to reflect new assumptions around payment and what is actually going to get paid of the credit that the telcos have outlaid. And then you have the service impact on the monthly basis. And this impacts prepaid and postpaid. This is not just a prepaid thing. If anybody's read our immigration impact on telco special report, you'll see very clearly that this is mostly hitting postpaid. The second prediction we have is around telcos adjusting marketing and their products and offerings to align with this economic situation. So we're seeing a trend where telcos are they're meeting the bifurcation where it is. That's how I'd understand this. So you have, on the higher end, you have more premium devices and plans. And then on the lower end, we're seeing more value-oriented plans coming into the market. I'm going to give you guys examples of this. The driver is the nature of the economy. Again, this is not just the US. This goes well beyond the US. We're seeing similar trends. And the result that we expect is that on the headline numbers, ARPU is probably going to continue incrementally increasing, okay? But if you pull back the layers and look at ARPU, you're going to see a divergence where the telcos are milking more out of the premium and they're getting less per sub per unit on the lower end of the K. And that trend is going to play out through this year. So I want to give some examples of this. One example is what T-Mobile is doing. And by the way, there is a document that is a companion document to this presentation where we outline the examples in there. I'm just going to give you guys the highlights of that. But if you want to see a little bit more meat around that, you can go see the report on this. So T-Mobile has been leaning into this bifurcation. I'm going to give you guys some examples of this. If anybody's noticed their marketing campaign recently, they have Billy Bob Thornton heavily pushing the T-Satellite service, and they're pushing how T-Mobile has the best network and all those things, but they're pushing on the satellite and having coverage everywhere. I sat back and I thought about that for a bit, and I was like, you know what? They're really appealing to that upper leg of the K, because people that really need ubiquitous coverage everywhere are people that can afford to travel. They can afford far-flung destinations, cruises, remote location. They may have a summer home in a place that has bad or not good connectivity. They're appealing to people who can afford the higher ARPU for the premium plan to get T priority. They're really subtly marketing to that upper leg of the K through that marketing campaign. That's how I'm interpreting that. And they have other marketing things that they've put out that are similar to this. If you guys want to see examples of that, I suggest taking a look at the full report. So this is definitely happening. We also see bifurcation in broadband between multi-gig, offerings, and we're seeing the more of economy level offerings at the lower end. Now, you could argue that that's because of FWA is skewing the solutions down on the band. But I would argue it's partly that, but it's also partly economic realities and how telcos and cable companies are adjusting to that. We're seeing more bifurcation on, in terms of, well, I don't want to get too far into it, but I suggest taking a look at the full report if you guys want to see more examples of this. Okay, so on this slide, what we're showing is the pyramid of the split here. So, and I want to put numbers behind this. So now I understand that triangle is not proportional. I got to fix that, but you get the idea, right? You have the top 10%, then you have the next 10. That group is doing very well. And then you have the rest of the market. Again, I'm talking in generalities here, but you get the idea. What we're saying is that the telcos and cable companies that best navigate this bifurcation are going to outperform. They're going to relatively outperform. And what we see here, if we do a split, there's roughly 130, I'll round it up, 133 million households in the US market, okay? And if you split that out, the top 20%, you're really talking about 27 million households in this country are in that top 20%. And we're seeing the telcos, we are seeing this in mapping. We're seeing it in the neighborhoods that are being targeted with offers. We are seeing this playing out quietly. But there is a lot of evidence that this is a trend. This has become a trend. And you have 106 million or so households are in that rest of market 80% bucket. On the business side, we see similar trends. We see SMBs are, a lot of SMBs are really struggling. They're struggling to meet payroll. They're dealing with cash flow considerations. They're dealing with tariffs. Whereas on the Fortune 2000 side, we see a lot of those companies are doing better than ever, right? They're really doing well from an equity valuation standpoint. In some cases, from a revenue growth standpoint, they're doing exceptionally well. Think about companies like the hyperscalers, the AI companies, the neo-scalers, companies that support that ecosystem. We're seeing tremendous growth there. Companies like Oracle, growth has been very strong. And then on the other side, you see other companies that are not doing as well. So we have bifurcation there. What we're seeing with telcos and the cable guys doing is more emphasis on premium and bifurcation of offerings for that top echelon. And we're seeing more flexibility in pricing and solutioning to retain and continue and extend those customer relationships with the portion of the market that's maybe struggling a little bit more, maybe struggling. Okay, the third prediction we have is that we're going to move from a quiet price war for broadband to a loud price war for broadband. And when I say loud, I mean you're going to see it clearly in marketing materials that are publicly mainstream. Okay, that's what we're expecting for this year. I want to be very clear on that. We're seeing, we already know what the trend is. We see gravitation for value. On the upper end of the side, they also are looking for value, but they're willing to pay a higher price, assuming the value is in balance. They will pay more and have the capacity to pay more. They were willing to pay more if the value's there. The common denominator is value. Everybody's looking for value for price paid for connectivity and connectivity-related services. This is not really a new thing, but we see more emphasis on looking at that. We see trade downs. We see people calling into call centers looking to change their plans if they're not using parts of it to reduce their bills. There's evidence of this that the call centers are really dealing with this at a higher volume than normal. Okay, higher volume than normal. We talked about the drivers there. The result we're expecting to go from quiet to loud, and we're going to see price evolution, and we're going to see plan evolution for high-speed broadband. Notice how I'm focusing on high-speed broadband. This is where we're really going to see this. On the mobile side, it might not be as clear because I would argue there's a little bit less competition, as we're going to show in a minute, on the mobile side as there is in the high-speed broadband side. So I want to make this very real. There is far more competitors in an individual market vying for the same premise, same customer than people think. And I want to pull back the curtain on this, and I want to make it very real for everybody. This is the reality of the market. So you have one XDSL legacy provider in most markets across this country. You have increasingly an FTTP provider. It could be an ILEC, it could be an incumbent, it could be a new player, could be an overbuilder. Some markets, we see 2 FTTP providers now. That's a lot, vying for the same customer. There's one coax or HFC provider. Usually it's a cable co. It could be a municipal provider, and that could be for FTTP as well. We see municipal broadband providers in some markets, utility companies, competing against telco or cable co. And now you've got up to 3 FWA competitors in a market, in one market, at a local level. And then you've got satellite now. And you're soon going to have 2 satellite providers. You're going to have Amazon Leo vying for the same subs, the same premises that Starlink is vying for now. As those price points come down for satellite, you're going to start to see bleed over into markets where FWA was going after those customers. So in many markets across this country, you have more than 3 providers of high-speed broadband. In some markets, we've counted 6 or more providers in one local market for high-speed broadband. At the end of the day, that customer, that household or business location, they're only buying once. So what I see is we have overbuilding. We have a saturation, an oversaturation of high-speed broadband. And as we know from history, this does not end well. This is going to cause a price war. People are going to fight for market share, and we're going to see this more pronounced, especially because household formation has dramatically slowed. We also have other trends that are adversely moving against the broadband market. We have birth rates in developed markets have dramatically come down, dramatically. There's no precedent historically for the level that birth rates are. So that means that the next generation, there isn't as many people. So you have a net reduction in premises that are going to need broadband. That's a multi-year, that's a generational cycle that's going to flow through this market. You have the baby boomers are, they're accelerating into retirement now. We're reaching that hump in terms of when a much greater portion of the boomers are retiring. We're in that right now in the US market. We are in that cycle. And what happens, right? This is stuff that nobody's talking about, but it needs to be talked about because these are things that people are going to be talking about for many years, because these are not a one-off year thing. These are multi-year trends that are going to play out and have significant impact on the market. The other thing we see is multi-generational households, where you have grandparents and grandchildren living in the same premise. They only need one broadband service. They don't need multiple broadband services. So you're getting one sale there from a telco perspective. You also have the immigration impact on the deportations. You have voluntary immigration, and you have deportation, and you have fewer visas being issued. So that impacts household formation. It also impacts the base level of household formation. So I mentioned 133 million households in this country. That number might start shrinking this decade. What do the telcos do, and the cable guys and the satellite guys and the utility broadband providers? What do they do when you have multiple providers vying for the same customer and there's fewer customers? They're going to start behaving in different ways. And in some cases, that might look desperate. Some of the strategies and behaviors you're going to see would likely take place. We're going to see M&A. We've already seen some. We're going to see more. We see Charter and Cox combining. That's a key merger. We see Verizon Frontier, Lumen, AT&T. Everybody's participating. All the big players are participating in M&A in some way. T-Mobile is. We see what's going on at a high level, and I would argue that part of the reason we're seeing that is because of these dynamics. The executives at the telcos, they know these trends because they plan out some of these things when they're planning their multi-year investments, and they're trying to make sure that they relatively outperform and are able to take market share in this type of market environment. Okay. So key takeaways, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So the K-shaped economy is real. You hear about it on the news. You hear about it from all kinds of sources. This is very real. This is not just people talking about something and it's like, well, is it real or is it not real? Like this is real. Okay, and there's tremendous evidence to see that underscores that this is a very real dynamic that's taking place. We're expecting it to become more pronounced this year. I forgot to mention something, and this isn't in the full report. When I say top 10% of households, that is any household making $250,000 in annual income or more per year. Okay, I want to be clear that that's what it takes to be considered top 10% according to the IRS tax tables and other sources that are used for calculating that are put out by the Federal Reserve, that are put out by other government agencies. That's where I'm getting that number from. So that's the cutoff basically. And then for top 20%, I forget the exact number off the top of my head, but it's in the hundreds. I think it's in the mid hundred. I think it might be like 150,000 per year in annual household income. Keep in mind that household income can be, it's usually combining multiple people that are reporting, like if you have married filing jointly, that's included in those income numbers that the government's putting out. So just keep that in mind. But those are the thresholds to keep in mind when thinking about economic dispersion and some of the trending that we're seeing when you peel back some of those layers. And also keep in mind that median household income, the median in the US currently is in the high 80s, okay? So, I mean, you can see right there from those 3 data points I just gave that there is significant dispersion in between the median and then what, how that flows out on the top quartile especially. So telcos are adjusting, and when I say CSPs, we're talking about telcos and cable cos. Okay, we're looping the cable guys in this as well. They're adjusting to this market reality, not just in the States. This is I would say most of the global GDP is in this scenario currently. We are expecting that the telcos and cable cos that pivot, that take this seriously, that lean into strategic adjustments, are going to relatively outperform the competitors. The telcos are going to weather the storm fine in aggregate, but you are going to see some players do much better, and you're going to see some players really struggle and maybe not exist anymore. And you're going to see that's not really new, but the pacing of it, I think, and the magnitude of the M&A. I mean, we're seeing some deals now in some countries that we would not have expected to happen just 5 years ago. We would have said there's no way the government would allow this M&A to happen. And then it happens with minimal concessions, relatively minor concessions. I mean, we're seeing this constantly when we look at the global telecom industry and cable industry. That's a very real trend that's playing out here. And that's a response and going to help some of these companies outperform. And this is also why I'm saying that on mobile, I don't think we're going to see mobile hit as hard as high-speed broadband, because if you look at the US market, for example, you've got really 3 players for mobile. And then you have a lot of sprawl on the MVNO side. But if you look at facilities-based telcos, you have 3. In high-speed broadband, you have many. So the competitive dynamics between mobile and fixed broadband is very different. So that's a key reason why we're saying that the price war is going to hit high-speed broadband first, and then we may see some more minor impact on the mobile broadband side. Okay, so with that, we'll open it up for Q&A. So I'm going to take these questions one after the other here. Feel free to add your question to the, there should be a Q&A box on your screen there. I'm just going to go right down the list. So the first question is, do you see prepaid playing any meaningful role in serving the lower arm of the K, or is postpaid still the strategic priority? So what we see is that, so we see postpaid very much remains top of mind and front and center for telco strategy. Prepaid is an afterthought. Now, I know some people will disagree with that, but the reality is telcos are actively pushing people into postpaid, and there's reasons they'd want to do that. Margins are better, retention is better, add-on opportunities are better for incremental revenue. You can lock in those subs, the churn's lower. There's reasons why they'd want to move people to postpaid, and they continue to do so. I don't know if we see bad debt expense significantly spike for telco, they may have to adjust their strategy for postpaid versus prepaid, and they may need to start leaning into prepaid again for certain customers that's just going to be better aligned with their needs and what they're going to be able to do from a budgetary standpoint. So I don't think prepaid is, I I think it's still relevant, and I think it might increase in relevancy, but it's not going to be like very significant. I think the telcos have vested interests to keep and retain people on the postpaid side versus migrating them down. The other thing is new sub ads is going to slow because I talked about birth rates falling, household formation. I talked about immigration trends. All of these things are net negative for net new mobile subscriptions. And because of that, the pool of new unconnected subscribers, unconnected customers, that pool is shrinking, and there's fewer to start them off in prepaid, if that makes sense. So the telcos are much less likely to move someone from postpaid to prepaid if they're already a postpaid customer, is what I'm trying to say. I don't think that's going to materially change from what it's been. The second question is, which customer segments are driving the increase in provisions for credit losses? Is it consumer, SMB, enterprise, something else? So we see it's a little bit of all those. So on the consumer side, it's mostly that bottom 50% is really where we're seeing that. On the SMB side, I would say that there's stratification there. You have some types of businesses that are doing much better than others, and that can weather economic cycles much better. Those ones are doing better. When you look at business as a whole, large enterprise versus SMB, there's a clear differential between how much better enterprise is doing versus SMB. I mean, we see trends there in terms of customer behavior trends, purchase behavior trends. These are things that we track and research at the company. So we see some differentials there between those types of customers. So the next question is, you argue the K-shaped economy will become more pronounced through 2026. What specific signals are you watching that tell you this is structural rather than cyclical? So I think if you look at trends in, let me think about that for a second here. So I think the structural things have to do with persistent wage growth that is below inflation. That has been structural. And when you pull back the layers, what we've seen, and this is over many decades, we've seen this in the US. Like we've seen this play out with automation, with offshoring. We've seen, more lower skill or, / blue collar type work. We've seen wage gains for those types of jobs have grown slower than general price increases for cost of living. Now that's a multi-decade structural trend that we've seen, and that continues. There was a slight phase during COVID where that wasn't the case, but we've reverted back to that long run trend. And that to me is a major indicator that there needs to be a more comprehensive policy reform, regulatory reform, and structural economic reform to change that equation. And until something like that happens, this will not be cyclical. This will be structural in nature. So I would say that's one of the big things to keep in mind. Obviously, there's other signals, but that's one of the big ones. And that's a trend that's played out for, like I said, I would say that's been playing out since the 50s, the late 50s. In the US, we've been seeing that dynamic.